Hurricanes, hailstorms, tornadoes, and wildfires. These are just some of the weather hazards that displace families and disrupt lives. Many of us are familiar with the scenes of devastation these hazards cause, and the recovery process for affected communities can take months, even years. In the most extreme circumstances, some may never be whole again. This may prompt many of you to ask what's being done to reduce the risks associated with these hazards. To answer this question, the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety presents the Disaster Discussions podcast. Join me, your host, Rachael Penton Gauthier, as I sit down with professionals in the insurance, science, construction, and resiliency industries who help us explore the intersection of these hazards with the built environment. We'll bring you in-depth conversations with experts from across the country and highlight how science is engineering real-world solutions from home and business owners to create safer, more resilient communities. Join us for these discussions every month, and to make sure you don't miss an episode, go subscribe to the Disaster Discussions podcast on your favorite podcast app. We also invite you to engage with us on social media to ask your questions, share your thoughts, and to learn more about the IBHS mission. Hello and welcome to the Disaster Discussions podcast, where we explore the intersection of weather and the built environment. I'm your host, Rachael Penton Gauthier, and today we are sitting down with the IBHS public policy team, and we're going to be talking about how we're advancing science-based public action to build resiliency for homeowners, businesses, and communities. And joining me today, we have Michael Newman, General Counsel for IBHS, and Manuela, Ekowo, Public Policy Associate. So thanks for joining us today, guys.
Thanks
so much for having us.
So first, I'd like to hear a little bit about everyone who comes to IBHS. Tell me a little bit about yourselves, your background, and how you ended up here at IBHS.
Manuela, go ahead.
Sure. Thanks for having us on, Rachel. I'm Manuela Ekowo. I'm the Public Policy Associate at IBHS. I work very closely with Michael to advance our policy goals at all levels of government. I have a background in public policy. I've been in the space for about 10 years, studied political science in undergrad, and since then have been really interested in economic opportunity and ways to create economic opportunity in the United States for low-income and middle-income families. And so I've had an opportunity to work on a range of issues that improve the lives, economic condition of everyday working people. So things like increased access to childcare, affordable health care, reforming our tax system so it's more fair and everyone's paying their fair share. I've also had the opportunity to work on strengthening the health of our democracy and protecting essential rights like voting rights and reforming how money is spent in our political system. And I came to IBHS about a year ago after my last role ended, and got an opportunity to work on climate and environmental issues, which is another core passion of mine. I never thought I would work at a place like IBHS, but I'm so glad that we found each other when we did.
Awesome. Michael, I know you've been here with IBHS a while. Tell me about how you ended up here.
Yeah, my career has taken a lot of zigs and zags, and while I'm incredibly fortunate to work at IBHS, it's not necessarily something I would have predicted 20 plus years ago. On a slightly somber note, today is September 11th that we're recording. It's been 20 years since the attacks of September 11th. I was a senior in college that year. And as with many Americans, probably all Americans, it made a huge impact on me. And joining the military was not for me. A tremendous amount of respect for those who it was and who joined the military following those attacks. But for me, wanting to get involved in government, wanting to give back and serve was something that that event had a huge impact on shaping my career. So my first job out of college was working on Capitol Hill as a staff assistant to a senator. the smartest, most thoughtful people on his staff were all lawyers. So that put me on a path to law school. Following law school with a mountain of debt, I joined a series of law firms and really learned a lot, became a much better thinker, writer, speaker, and also learned that I didn't particularly want to be a litigator at a law firm for my career. So after 8 years of doing that in Philadelphia, I moved to Washington, D.C., was very fortunate to get a job at the Treasury Department working for the Federal Insurance Office, where I got a deep understanding and background in the role of insurance in our country, in our society, in our economy. Was fortunate enough to get to work on issues around natural hazard mitigation and climate change. And I got to meet IBHS. In fact, as a relatively new senior policy analyst, I think was my official title, at the Treasury Department, I flew down to Richburg, South Carolina, and visited IBHS as a guest. I got to do a tour. I got to meet and have a roundtable discussion in our big conference room, all about policy and its intersection with the work of IBHS. Little did I know on that fateful day so many years ago that I would someday come back and work for IBHS. So I spent some time at Treasury Department working for the Federal Insurance Office. I spent more time doing international cybersecurity policy. Very, very fortunate that in 2020, our former General Counsel, Deborah Ballin, reached out to me and asked if I'd be interested in coming to work with her on the really important work of IBHS and translating that science into good, strong, smart public policy that enhances the resilience of our families and our businesses and our communities. So I joined about 4 years ago now, and it's been a blast ever since.
Yeah, Michael, when I met you back in April and you introduced yourself as the IBHS lawyer, I think you said something to the effect of you're having a great week if you're not having to do the lawyer part of your job and you're getting to do the public policy part of your job. So I took that to mean you're very passionate about the public policy side of what you do.
Well, I'm also very passionate about representing IBHS as its general counsel. But at the end of the day, if I'm too involved in things, that means there's a legal issue that we need to worry about. So
Right.
It is what gets me fired up is thinking about how we can translate our science into actions that help our communities and our families. So certainly, if I'm doing more on the public policy side and there are fewer demands on me on the legal side, I think that's better for all of us. But it's also what gets me excited and passionate about coming to work.
Exactly. All right. Well, we are going to talk about all the different projects you guys are both involved in. But first, public policy, that's a broad term. So how do you two define public policy, particularly, and how it applies to what you do here at IBHS?
Sure. So basically, for us, public policy means educating lawmakers on IBHS's building science and solutions and encouraging them to act. So that largely means increasing public and private investments in climate resilient solutions and housing and resilient construction practices. Our ultimate objective is to increase the number of families that live in climate resilient homes and the number of people that do business and work in climate resilient workplaces and businesses.
Yeah, I'd like to foot stomp what Manuela said. We're really in the education game. As a 501c3 nonprofit, IBHS doesn't lobby. So you're not going to find Manuela or I haunting the halls of Capitol Hill or in state capitals around the country. But what you will find us do is engaging lawmakers and policymakers, stakeholders, basically everyone who is involved in the creation of the policies around how we organize our country, the laws, the regulations, and the like. Our ultimate goal is to take the knowledge that's developed at IBHS and help provide that to those policymakers, to those lawmakers. So when they're making decisions about housing, about disaster recovery, about disaster preparedness, that they're doing it with the best information IBHS can provide. We don't do it alone. You're looking at the entirety of the IBHS public policy team, We are small but mighty, and we succeed when we partner with others, when we're collaborating with our member companies. IBHS is made up of our members from primary insurers and reinsurers, our affiliate and associate members as well. And when we're working with them and their public policy teams and their state councils, when we're working with the state insurance trade associations, when we're working with advocates and public policy folks from other industries, and we're finding common ground and ways to advance making our homes and our communities safer, that's when we're really succeeding.
All right. Well, when we hear you guys give presentations, we often hear you refer to different public policy lanes, and we're going to dive into each of those in the podcast today. But just to give them a quick mention up front, some of the things we'll be discussing today include building codes, wildfire, retrofits, disaster recovery, affordable housing, and meeting the need for investment. So we're going to talk a little bit about each of those, but I want to start with the risk that people face and kind of why we do what we do here at IBHS. So far this year, we've had 19 separate billion-dollar weather events. So far, the year not over yet. And every American faces disaster risk of some sort. Some face multiple hazards, and about 40% of the population lives in coastal states. So, of course, they're under the threat for hurricanes. And 1/4 of the population faces wildfire risk. So this really makes preparedness and response a national priority. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, as we speak, Hurricane Francine is barreling up the coast towards Louisiana, which is at this point facing on average one significant hurricane every 2.8 years at this point. And that's just one state in our nation. I think we absolutely need to treat severe weather and its impacts on our families, on our businesses, and our communities, its impacts on the insurance markets in this country. And I should add that there isn't one insurance market in the United States. The way we have our system of state regulation, there's actually 56 different insurance jurisdictions with slightly different regulatory environments in our one country. So how we approach the health of all of those insurance markets and the safety and security of all of our families and communities really requires a shift in our thinking, where we're not responding and recovering from disasters, but doing work up front to help us become more resilient to them. And there's hope. Because of the work at IBHS, there are solutions to mitigate our known risks. We know how to make homes safer to high winds. We know how to make multifamily buildings, commercial structures, more able to withstand the forces of hurricanes, severe convective storms. We know how to make homes less likely to ignite in a wildfire. And we know the types of public policies, the laws, the regulations, the approaches that will actually make a difference in reducing risk and making insurance markets healthier. We know that because we do the science here at IBHS and we translate it into actions, programs like our Fortified program and our Wildfire Prepared program. And we work with policymakers in states as disparate as Alabama and Minnesota and California and Kentucky to advance policies that are going to help us to reduce that risk, to make homeowners safer by making their homes safer. The need is so real. As of the end of August, there was $60 billion in nat cat losses in the United States alone. That accounted for 70% of all global insured losses. Think about that. Our one country is accounting for 70% of global insured losses. So there's a lot of work to do, but the good news is we have a pretty good sense of what to do, and now it's about how are we going to achieve it.
Yeah, I kind of think of things here at IBHS as a multi-part relay race. We have our researchers who do the actual research and take a look at the science, and then of course we translate that to our members, and then you guys are kind of the final handoff, and you go into the wide world of public policy. And once it gets to your leg of the race, it doesn't move quite as fast as it does from our, we have our research and we can get that put into solutions pretty quickly in the grand scheme of things here at IBHS. But I know the work you guys do, it's more of a marathon race. It takes time.
Yeah, that's right. I've actually run a couple of marathons, and I can tell you they are long, particularly when you're as slow as me. They are long and they are sometimes painful, but there are moments of exhilaration, and that's a really good metaphor for our work. We are absolutely driving the ball forward, pushing the boulder up the hill, use whatever metaphor you want. But we're seeing success, and really great thing for me at least, is that when we achieve success in the public policy lane, we know that we're helping families. We know that we're helping communities. As I'm a parent, I got a first grader and a third grader, and I think all the time how our house, our home, is a source of stability for them in their life. And what I want more than anything is for all kids across our country to have that same sense of home and that same sense of stability, and making sure that their home is going to be able to withstand the risks that we know it will face, whether that is a home in Louisiana or a home in Massachusetts or a home in Oklahoma or California. That's really what gets me excited about our work.
Yeah, I think that really that's what drives it all for us here at IBHS, is seeing those solutions, be put into action in the real world, seeing those real life results, really making a difference in people's lives. And that brings me to a part of our IBHS mission, which is we don't believe in resilience for certain groups. We believe in resilience for all, and that it should be accessible to everyone. Talk a little bit about that, Manuela.
Sure. So everyone can obviously benefit from climate resilient homes and businesses. Everyone deserves to live in a climate resilient community, as Michael alluded to. Unfortunately, severe weather doesn't discriminate, and our solutions to keeping people safe shouldn't either. We know that low income and other vulnerable groups are more vulnerable to severe weather and have often less resources to bounce back and recover from natural disasters. And so we shouldn't leave these groups behind as we increase communities across the country's resilience to the severe weather that they face.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say, we say the term survivability here at IBHS a lot. Expand on that, Michael.
Yeah, I think resilience is one of those terms we use all the time, but we're not the only ones. We talk about a resilient home. If you watched football this past Sunday or Saturday, you probably heard about a team that came back from being down. They're a resilient team. They came back. We think about resilience in so many different contexts, and it's a useful term. But as we think about what we're trying to accomplish with our science in communities, in the policy space and beyond, it's about survival. Sure, I mean, at absolute bare minimum, we want people to survive severe weather. We want them to continue to live their lives. And too often, unfortunately, we see where survival is not always guaranteed, and that's heartbreaking. But even beyond that, we think about the survival of the home, so that families, after they evacuate, can come home and have a home to come back to, so they can get on with their lives, they can get back to work, their kids can get back to school. We think about survival of their way of life, that they and their neighbors still have that sense of community, that they still have a job to go to, that they can continue to bring in money to pay the bills and buy groceries and such. We think about survival as this sense of, yes, it's your life, it's also your home, it's also your community, it's also your sense of economic stability. That's really the power of what more resilient construction can accomplish.
Yeah, I think back to, to things like back in the early 90s, we didn't have as much tornado lead time as we have now. Now we have a pretty significant lead time on certain severe weather events. We know hurricanes are coming days in advance. So from a scientific standpoint, our lead time on these disasters is much better than it used to be. So these storms, as you mentioned, they are survivable, or more survivable than when we had less of that scientific data. But now we're trying to take that a step further and not just survive the actual storm, but as you mentioned, we want that way of life to survive, and we want these communities to be able to move forward and just get back to normal as soon as possible.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to talk about our wildfire research here. And again, going back to the science, that science has advanced significantly. And we now know the mitigations that matter. We have uncovered those through our research here at IBHS, but the policies have not yet caught up. Talk a little bit about why that is.
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. It's really a matter of the nascency of the field, right? We've been studying wind, and by we I mean IBHS, but also the broader kind of scientific community, for decades and decades. And that knowledge, although it continues to grow and build on itself, has worked its way into building codes and mapping and the way that we approach these issues from a policy perspective for a long time. With wildfire, we are learning in real time what those mitigations that matter are. It wasn't so long ago that IBHS put out its suburban adaptations roadmaps, identifying those mitigations that matter, that we created our wildfire prepared program to put those mitigations that matter into a designation program that homeowners could take advantage of. So it's not really surprising that from the public policy space, all of that knowledge, which is relatively recent, is not yet totally worked its way into how we're approaching policies around wildfire. The other piece, I think, is that wildfire is really complicated, and you have these dynamics of forest management and fire services and fire adapted communities. And so you have this interplay of different responsibilities at the federal level and the state level and the local level, and different agencies at each one of those levels, all of which have different expertise. A state forester or someone who's involved in forestry at the national federal level, they know about trees, they know about forest management. They're not necessarily thinking about, well, how do we lower the risk of community conflagration at a neighborhood scale? They're not necessarily thinking about what are the mitigations that could help prevent a home from igniting in a wildfire context. So part of it is we have a lot of new science over the last few years that we're bringing into the world, which is terrific. And part of it is there's just so many different types of policymakers and public servants involved in this issue of wildfire. And so bringing that knowledge to them to help inform them and find the right people who have responsibility for the built environment is all kind of a complex undertaking.
Yeah, we know some of those major conflagrations occurred in that 2016, 2017, 2018 timeframe, and that's when we really began hitting the ground hard with wildfire research here at IBHS. One of the big mitigations that we have uncovered here is that defensible space in non-combustible zone 0. That's a big part of our wildfire prepared home program. So talk about that and that system of mitigation actions and how you guys are working to get that eventually into local and state codes in some of our wildfire states.
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. So unlike other perils, like wind, wildfire isn't included in our regular building codes. And I know we're going to talk about building codes in just a little bit. But if you have your international residential code, your international building code, they absolutely have provisions about interior fire, but they're not focused on fire coming from the exterior, the embers and flames and radiant heat that come in from the wildfire context. What we do have are things like WUI codes. WUI is one of those jargony type acronyms that exist in the kind of science and public policy space. It stands for Wildland Urban Interface. And it's that sort of squishy area where the natural environment and the built environment are coming together. So we are building more and more as we try to create more housing for our growing population in areas where the natural environment is conducive to wildfire, where there are a lot of natural fuels, where the slope and the wind may contribute to extreme fire behavior. So that space where we live and where wildfires burn kind of come together and overlap, that's what we're talking about when we say the WUI. So there are codes, WUI codes, that address how you can build, how you can design and construct homes and maintain landscape that is going to reduce risk from wildfires. It is a patchwork quilt at best in how those codes have been adopted into state or local law. California has a statewide WUI code. It's called Chapter 7A. There are other states, Utah and Pennsylvania, if you can believe it, has a statewide WUI code. In other states, it's more of a jurisdiction by jurisdiction approach. It's a bit of a patchwork, and frankly, it's a patchwork quilt that has a lot of holes in it. So we are trying to talk to policymakers up and down levels of government about the importance of codes for reducing wildfire risk. Our great team of folks who work on the codes in the codes arena are working to incorporate IBHS science into the development of these consensus codes and standards. So that's a really important piece. Another important piece is defensible space, as you mentioned. We know that there is a whole set of mitigation actions that really matter for reducing risk, and that they all need to be undertaken. But perhaps first among equals is the importance of having a non-combustible zone 0, or that 5-foot zone around structures. So we're working in states like California and elsewhere to encourage them as they are building out these regulations for defensible space, particularly for that zone 0, that 5-foot zone, that they take all the combustibles out. And that means natural fuels like plants, vegetation. It means other things like plastic chairs and wood piles for the for your fire pit or your fireplace inside. Those are the things that they can't be in that 5-foot zone, because as the embers come in, if they land and ignite that material, those flames and heat and embers can then ignite the home, and that's what we really want to prevent.
Right, and right now this is our wildfire prepared home in most locations is a voluntary action that really any homeowner can follow. But what we're working towards is having this kind of a regular way of life in these communities that are in those wildfire risk zones. And you guys have been successful already in a couple of things. Tell me some of those examples. I know there was an HOA bill in Colorado, and you've worked with the WUI Code Board to make some strides as well. So tell me a little bit about both of those.
Yeah, so this is an area where, again, I mentioned partnerships before, where we don't act alone. We don't act in a vacuum. The state of Colorado is a really good example. We work closely with the Rocky Mountain Insurance Association, with our members who are active in Colorado. And what we're trying to do is educate those policymakers, educate those lawmakers. So as they are making decisions, they're doing so with the best wildfire science that they can. And frankly, the best IBHS science, because hail is just as much of an issue, if not more, in Colorado than wildfire is. So we've worked really closely with those policymakers, with those other key stakeholders. And you mentioned two examples. The first is the WUI Code Board. Colorado is, as we mentioned, we'll talk more about building codes in a few moments, but Colorado is what we call a home rule state. That means they don't have a statewide code, and they have a very strong sensibility that decisions around building codes should be made at the local level. And yet wildfire is such an issue across the state that they enacted a piece of legislation to create a wildfire resilience code board, or a WUI code board, that is empowered to come up with a statewide WUI code approach for minimum requirements around wildfire risk. So we think that's really great. It was great that they created that body, and we are helping to advise it so that IBHS science is being incorporated into the good work that they're doing. The other piece of legislation from earlier this year concerned homeowners associations. Now, homeowners associations are, some of you may be in one, some of you not. I'm now living in one for the first time. And, it is a neighborhood that has some requirements around it. Sometimes they tell you what type of landscaping you can have, or what type of house you need to have, what color roof you can have. And homeowners associations can be really powerful in dictating what homeowners can do with their property. And that can be used for good or ill, particularly in a wildfire context. In Colorado, there are homeowners associations that were telling their members, their homeowners, you must have a wooden privacy fence that extends all the way to your house. That is the look that we want in our neighborhood. Well, that might be a nice look. I'm not going to pass judgment on anyone's sense of aesthetics, but it's terrible for wildfire risk. I mean, a wooden fence, which is combustible, it's wood, that extends all the way to the home through that 0 to 5 area I just mentioned, acts as a wick. We've seen it in experiment after experiment after experiment. It carries the flames to the home and then ignites the home. So it's a bad idea. So this HOA legislation kind of falls into that category of stop stupid. It prevents homeowners associations from requiring that homeowners cannot undertake wildfire resilience actions. I said that poorly. Let me try to rephrase it. It prevents homeowners associations from prohibiting homeowners from undertaking those mitigation actions. And it specifically references wildfire standards like wildfire prepared. So we think that's a really good piece of legislation that ought to be repeated in other states with wildfire risk, in places like California, New Mexico, Oregon, Washington.
Right. So if a homeowner who belongs to an HOA, wants to remove those bushes from the first 5 feet of their home and wants to replace that wooden fence with a non-combustible fence, they have the right to do so now, thanks to this bill. And the HOA, can't send them a fine, leave them a note on the door any longer. And if you're in this particular area, so yeah, certainly a big win there. And we've got a lot of work to do in the wildfire space, but I know you guys are on top of that. I want to switch to building codes now. And just for some background for folks listening, we have not seen a new state adopt a statewide code since the state of Louisiana did so in the aftermath of Katrina back in the early 2000s. And many states actually do not have statewide codes in place. Even if they do, they may not be uniformly enforced. We know all about that from our Rating the States project that we put out every 3 years. And only about 35% of counties, cities, and towns have the latest building code in place. So homeowners and renters may be vulnerable and not even know it. So what are you doing to push for statewide codes around the country?
Yeah, so building codes matter a lot. They're the first line of defense against severe weather, and they set the minimum requirements for how homes and buildings are constructed. And we have research, and there's tons of research out there to show that enforced codes work. And as you said, the problem is that too many communities lack a modern enforced code and live in a community where they're not receiving the protections from in modern building codes. And you're right. Louisiana was the last state to adopt a new statewide code after Hurricane Katrina. So we're talking almost 20 years ago. And a lot has obviously changed in 20 years. Our climate has changed, how we build has changed, and where we build has changed. And so what we do as the public policy team is share the science behind why modern and enforced codes matter. We share our research and our analysis on the code environment with decision makers who have the power or are in positions to make improvements in their communities. So as you mentioned, our Rating the States report is a perfect example of the kind of research and analysis we share with decision makers across the country to nudge them to adopt and enforce modern building codes. We also
I was just going to say another example of some of the research that we do that then provides Manuela and I with proof points, if you will, for why these things matter. Following Hurricane Ian, we did a study of over 4,000 structures in Florida that were in the direct path of the storm. And even for someone like myself that really believes in the importance and the efficacy of building codes, the results were eye-opening. The year 2000 is sort of a demarcation point of when the modern code era begins. And as an aside, Florida has one of the best building codes in the nation. They're consistently top 3 of our Rating the States report every 3 years. Today, their requirements are more or less on par with our fortified program, the technical requirements in that fortified program. So we expected to see support for the proposition that building codes work in Florida, but it was remarkable. Of those 4,000 plus structures that we looked at, if you look at that year 2000 breakpoint, structures built after 2000, there was little to no structural damage. Structures built before 2000, pretty high incidence of structural damage. So we know, it's not just we hope, but we know that building codes, when they are modern, meaning they have the latest in what we know about how to build structures better, and they're enforced, can help drive down the damages and the loss associated with severe weather.
Did you have something to add, Manuela?
No, I did.
Okay. Well, we'll move on to the next part of this discussion, and that's about some places that have either no codes or older codes. What are you doing about those states? What kind of strides are you making there?
Sure. So we've also developed policy tools in addition to our research and policy tools to help local jurisdictions increase their community's resilience. So we have code supplements for inland areas and for coastal areas that want to beef up their local codes to achieve our fortified standard. And then for communities that live in areas that are prone to wildfires, we have a model code ordinance that allows those communities to strengthen their protection against wildfire and align their codes to our wildfire prepared standards.
Yeah, and another great example I want to talk about, you guys mentioned the success of the Florida building code after Hurricane Ian, but we've also seen success after Hurricane Sally down in coastal Alabama, Mobile and Baldwin County. Talk about that as an example of how we've been successful in the codes arena.
Sure. So in around 2012 and through the 2014, 2 coastal communities in Alabama, Mobile and Baldwin counties, adopted our fortified coastal code supplements. So now, since 2012, 2014, all new or replaced roofs that are being replaced have to be built to the fortified standard.
Yeah, we saw very little damage after Hurricane Sally just a couple of years ago.
Mm-hmm. And just to be clear, these building code supplements aren't requiring fortified designations. They're requiring the level of resilience associated with the fortified program. So there's not a single jurisdiction out there that's saying thou shalt get a fortified designation as part of their building code. What they're saying is you'll do all the things required by the fortified standard. And it's a small but I think important distinction. And I think this is another example, this area, where partnerships matter so very much. So when we're working on code issues, we have allies, we have friends, we have other organizations that care about these issues too. FEMA at the federal level is a major booster of the importance of building codes. We're fortunate to have an MOU, a Memorandum of Understanding, with FEMA. We're always looking for opportunities to partner with them on code issues. Same with the organization called Flash. We also have an MOU with Flash and work closely with them on advancing building codes. I'm on an MOU kick, so I'll also mention that we have a memorandum of understanding with the National Association of Insurance Commissioners. That's the association that brings together all the state insurance regulators. We work closely with the NAIC and with state insurance regulators, some of whom have responsibility over building codes in their state, to help educate and advance this notion that minimum requirements or building codes really do make a difference. And then finally, I think it's really important to note that particularly when it comes to building codes, the insurance industry has a really strong interest in those minimum requirements, but so does the building industry, and so do realtors. And so when we can come together with insurers and builders and realtors, and scientists, right, as part of that, we being IBHS with that scientific perspective, when we can come together and reach areas of shared understanding and shared desired outcomes, we can be really successful. Because builders are concerned necessarily about the cost of building houses. They want to build houses that they can sell that are affordable. But if they can't build homes that get insured because they're building in risky areas and there's not sufficient resilience, that's a problem for them. And if realtors can't sell homes because they're not sufficiently resilient to be able to access affordable insurance, that's a problem for them. So there are these places where we can come together with shared goals. And I do think that we are increasingly seeing building codes as an area where, far from divisions, we're able to find areas of shared desired outcomes.
Yeah, that brings us to retrofits and more partners to discuss. We have lots of organizations we've worked with for grant programs, and we recognize that in many cases, upgrading to a fortified roof that above code standard requires a retrofit when you're re-roofing. And kind of talk about some of those organizations we've worked with, several different states now when it comes to our fortified grants, as well as our grants for our wildfire prepared home program as well.
Sure. So while building codes are really important for new construction, and that's when they kind of come into play, new construction only accounts for a small percentage of the current housing stock. Existing homes and businesses make up a vast majority of the housing supply. And so we help policymakers understand the value of investing public funds in resilient construction and retrofits through fortified grant programs. So today, 7 states have established fortified state grant programs, from Alabama being the oldest, to Minnesota, to Oklahoma, and in between. And the grant programs themselves vary state by state in terms of what they require, but generally speaking, they allow grants up to $10,000 to homeowners who live in single-family homes to retrofit them to IBHS's fortified standard. And they're really successful. So as I said, Strength in Alabama Homes is the oldest of such programs, and since 2011, they have invested over $70 million into the program and have helped over 7,000 homeowners get fortified roofs.
You know, I think the litany of states Manuela just mentioned, what's so interesting and powerful is that there are red states and there are blue states. Right? You may not get the governors of Alabama and Minnesota and Oklahoma agreeing on all that much, but this is an area where they do agree. And we are a nonpartisan organization, but the importance of resilience is an issue that is not partisan at all. And we work really closely with Republicans and Democrats and all points in between, because at the end of the day, I think policymakers want their homes, their communities to be safe and secure and able to withstand the weather that's coming their way. And they want their insurance markets to be healthy, where everyday people have access to affordable insurance. So it's really nice to see in these grant programs that are really gathering momentum. And again, it's an area where we're working closely with NEIC on this issue. In fact, we just had a delegation to the research center at IBHS last week, meeting with some of the states that have new grant programs in place, places like Oklahoma and Mississippi. And we're seeing this momentum grow, and we're seeing it grow across the political spectrum. We're seeing it regionally diverse as well, where there are southeastern states, but also Midwestern states, central states, because there is such a great need all over the country.
Now, we know a lot of this as far as our Fortified Grant Program. One of those states that really helped kick off our Fortified program is Alabama. Tell me about the kind of 4-pillar story of Alabama, Michael.
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. So Alabama has a very successful grant program, the Strengthen Alabama Homes program that Manuela referenced. And Alabama remains the bedrock of our Fortified program with over 50,000 designations in that one state alone. And yet of that more than 50,000 designations, only about 17% are derived from the grant program. So there's something more at play. And what we see in Alabama being really successful in adopting Fortified, and by the way, having a really healthy insurance market, is it really rests on those 4 pillars. The first, of course, is the grant program, which I'll speak to in just a moment why we think that's so effective. But second is the building code environment. While Alabama doesn't have a statewide building code, it was referenced earlier in our conversation how Mobile County and Baldwin County have adopted the building code supplement that puts fortified roof as their minimum requirements. Third is incentives, price considerations in the insurance context. Now, in Alabama, that looks like mandatory discounts for fortified designations in the insurance context. But in other states, there are insurers that are on a voluntary basis offering price considerations for fortified. And then the last, and this is really important, is local engagement, particularly with the private sector. And that's where grant programs can have such a catalyzing impact. See, when a state stands up a grant program, a whole ecosystem has to grow up around it and around our Fortified program. That ecosystem involves builders and roofers and contractors and evaluators. We're not getting into the details of the Fortified program today, but part of it, an important part of it, is not just a technical standard, but an independent evaluation process, so that there's an evaluator who's collecting documentation that the roof or the home is being built to our IBHS standard, and then a quality assurance process on the back end that we do at IBHS. So you need to have this workforce that develops. And as a grant program stands up, there's new business to be had. There's millions of state dollars being invested in Fortified. So roofers get trained. Contractors get trained. They get certified in Fortified. Evaluators get trained and come into a new state, a new jurisdiction. That's creating a workforce. That's creating a supply for fortified, resilient construction and roofing. And then on the other side, the supply side, from your microeconomic days, you've got the recipients of those grants, and they're able to say, hey, I got this grant so I could get a new roof, and it's a fortified roof. They share with their friends and their family and their neighbors. And then, if it's a really bad day and a weather event happens, like Hurricane Sally in Alabama, all of a sudden it's the families that have the fortified roof that are sheltering their neighbors that have a blue tarp on top of their house. And that's when you really start seeing a demand signal where people say, hey, I want one of these fortified roofs because I see that it works. So a grant program, yes, it's absolutely helping those individual recipients of the grants, and that's a wonderful thing. But on a structural level, almost more importantly, it's creating this catalyst for a private market growth where you have both supply and demand for fortified. And that's when, like in the Alabama story, we see this huge takeoff of the program in a much healthier insurance market in the state, in a much more resilient community with homes that have that characteristic of survivability that we're looking for.
Yeah, really seeing these, these programs put to the test is, I think, what really drives home the benefits for the average homeowner. Seeing your neighbor's roof survive a hurricane, really, that gets you thinking, okay, I need to do something about my own roof. And speaking of, as our wildfire prepared home program continues to expand, we now are beginning to see some grant programs come online to help homeowners mitigate against wildfire. So just tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, there is a grant program in California that's standing up, but there's also some other interesting things happening in the wildfire space, and I'd ask Manuela to talk about it, because at the end of the day, there's not enough free money, grant money in our nation, and right at the local level, at the state level, at the federal level, to pay for all the retrofits that really do need to happen. So we need to find other financial mechanisms to help people get to a greater level of that survivability. So Manuela, maybe you can speak to some of the things we're seeing out in California.
Sure. So one of our close partners, Neighborhood Partnership Housing Services, or IBHS, they're a community development organization in California. And they recently launched two loan programs to help homeowners in the areas in California in which they serve obtain a wildfire prepared designation. So the first loan program is an emergency loan program, and it provides $5,000 in loan assistance to homeowners who quickly need to get a wildfire prepared designation. And then they have a larger home improvement loan program that would provide $50,000 in loan assistance to homeowners to make larger home improvements to their properties, as well as mitigate their homes against wildfire by obtaining a wildfire prepared designation.
All right. Well, we know it'll take some time to see the same successes that we've seen with Fortified, but we are on that road now with Wildfire Prepared Home. I want to talk a little bit about disaster recovery. We want to not only respond and to these disasters, but we want to prepare ahead of time. We want to engage with some of those national and state agencies to encourage them to invest in disaster recovery funds ahead of time. And talk about how you're working with some of these organizations and working with different state governments to kind of incorporate resilience into what they're doing.
Yeah, when disasters happen, when the bad day happens, so often there's the disaster after the disaster. You have the natural disaster, but then you have the economic disaster that follows, where people are unhoused, where tax bases disappear. So disaster recovery is a way we as a country, not we as IBHS, but we as a country are trying to address that. And it really does happen at the local, at the state, the federal level. There are ramifications for each one of those levels of government. And we work with all of them. We work with FEMA and HUD and SBA, the Small Business Administration, as well as state agencies, to encourage them to invest their disaster recovery funds, because there's always a huge influx of dollars, usually from the federal level, that flood the zone of areas that have a presidentially declared disaster. We want that to be used wisely so that the recovery is kind of resilient centric. They're building back better than they were before. But that's really hard to do. It's actually been one of the areas of greatest learning for me personally at IBHS. You would think that following a disaster, if a town burns to the ground, if a community is deeply impacted by a tornado or a hurricane, that would be the time when everyone starts thinking, well, how can we build back better so that we don't experience this again? But it's really hard. It really is. After a disaster, people are struggling. Many times, something we learned from when we were out in Maui following the Lahaina fire is the people involved in local government are mourning their own losses, are trying to recover with their own families, while at the same time trying to drive a recovery process to help their community. So it's not really the best time to try to introduce changes. What we need to do is have the right pieces in place ahead of time. So we are increasingly trying to work with state, local, federal government to educate about the importance of building codes, the importance of including better construction techniques into hazard mitigation plans. So all of those puzzle pieces are in place. So in the difficult days following a disaster, it's they're there, they're waiting, and the community can turn to them to help drive their recovery. And Louisiana actually gives us a really good example of this. Unfortunately, we talked about this earlier, Louisiana has far more than its fair share of significant hurricanes that make landfall. And again, we are thinking about the people of Louisiana today as they prepare for the landfall of Hurricane Francine. But what they learned in storm after storm after storm, where they recover from a storm and then they build back, and then those same houses and buildings that they built back get damaged by the next storm, and on, is that better construction techniques, resilient construction techniques, need to be a part of the equation. So the Office of Community Development, which is the state body in Louisiana that receives HUD disaster recovery grants. There's a HUD program called Community Development Block Grant, or CDBG. They have a disaster recovery grant that just takes huge amounts of money and funnels it down to the state level to help with disaster recovery in the years following a major disaster. So they actually required that hundreds of millions of dollars of this CDBGDR money that went into rebuilding affordable housing be built to our fortified standard. And they did it because they learned about fortified in advance and made that affirmative decision they were going to no longer build back in the same way. And down the line, that's really helping Louisiana have more of a foundation of resilient housing in the affordable housing space.
Yeah, I was a broadcast meteorologist before this, and I was usually on the ground in the aftermath of disasters doing the reporting. And the most common response I got from these homeowners who just lost their homes was, A, I can't believe this happened to me, usually followed by, B, well, this will probably never happen again. But you gave Louisiana an example, 5 landfalling storms in the 2020 season, and Moore, Oklahoma, another great example, that F5 tornado in May 1999, and some of those same neighborhoods were again affected by an EF5 tornado in 2013. So with our changing climate, we know storms are becoming more frequent, often in some of the same areas. So we are at the point where we can't just build back, as you mentioned. We have to build back better. We're seeing these compounding disasters, and we're at the point where it may not only happen to you, but it may happen to you more than once, and more than once in your community. So I think you guys talked a lot about education in the beginning of this conversation, and really that's where I think that education comes in, is helping people understand the science ahead of time and the solutions that are available ahead of time, so that when it is time to build back, we're able to build back more resiliently. I want to talk about affordable. Go ahead,
Rachel,
Michael.
just one more point on that. And we recognize that there are competing priorities that communities, that policymakers are making. We undoubtedly have a housing crisis in this nation, in many parts of our nation. There simply isn't enough housing. It is expensive. People are trying to find homes. There are first-time home buyers who are having difficulty finding an affordable home for them to purchase. We understand that, and we understand that policymakers are weighing these issues. But fundamentally, we think resilience should be part of housing policy, because if we're trying to get people housed, we also want to keep people housed. And particularly in these high-risk areas, in parts of California that face frequent wildfire risk, in states like Louisiana and other Gulf states that face frequent hurricane risk, it's not enough to have housing. We need to have resilient housing so that we're not compounding, to your point, we're not compounding a housing crisis where there isn't enough housing by every time a storm rolls through, every time a wildfire sparks, we're losing housing. We want to build housing that will last and will be able to withstand that severe weather that we know is in those areas.
Exactly. And that brings me to the next topic of affordable housing, which I want to talk about now. And we know that building that affordable housing, part of resilience, or resilience is a necessary part of this. And we know that those vulnerable populations are at least able to withstand severe weather as well as those consequences. So the goal of affordable housing, not just to get people housed, but as you mentioned, to keep people housed. And you guys have a few examples of how this has already been successful in some of your work. Tell me about some of those examples.
Sure. So yeah, we believe that, as Michael said, resilience and affordable housing should go hand in hand. Resilient affordable housing does a few things. It keeps families housed following disasters. It keeps local economies intact, and it provides savings to families not only on day one, but every day after that. When families can return home following disasters, this supports local economies by preventing businesses from having to close down because they can't find workers. And it also protects the local tax base because it keeps people in those communities and generating economic activity in those communities. Affordable housing also should provide savings to residents, not just when they sign up for a mortgage or sign up for a lease, but on an ongoing basis as well. So when you invest in resilient construction, that can provide ongoing savings through avoided damages from severe weather and reduced insurance premiums, which reflect the reduction in risk.
Yeah, and I know an example of that, the Bayou Lafourche apartments down in Louisiana, one of our first fortified multifamily homes. Talk about what happened with that apartment complex and the results of that success there.
Sure. So Bayou Lafourche was hit. It was one of the, as you said, first fortified multifamily properties. It was in the eye of Hurricane Ida, which is a Category 4 hurricane that made landfall in Lockport, Louisiana in 2021. And it survived Hurricane Ida with minimal damage and only opened up a few weeks behind schedule.
And something notable about that project, it was funded by, I mentioned before that the Office of Community Development in Louisiana had received these CDBG disaster recovery grants. It was funded in part from those grants, as well as funding from the Louisiana Housing Corporation. So, and the Federal Home Loan Bank of Dallas, which we'll speak about in just a minute. So this is a perfect example of a housing project that received public investment. And because it received that public investment, it was required to be built to a higher level of resilience that really paid off when Hurricane Ida made landfall. And there were housing projects built by the same developers just down the road that were really destroyed by the fierce winds of Hurricane Ida. And yet this Les Maisons de Bayou Lafourche, and I butcher the name of it every time. I apologize, Rachel. I know you're from that area. It now houses some of the folks who lost their homes in Hurricane Ida. It's really powerful.
Yeah, that's a great example there. We've kind of done some further thought on this. I want to talk about the Section 8 housing paper that is now available on IBHS.org. And you guys actually modeled what would happen if all Section 8 housing was fortified. And talk a little bit about what you guys found from this project.
Yeah, so that's a new paper that we put out. We explored opportunities to enhance the resilience of Section 8 multifamily and single family housing in the Atlantic and Gulf Coasts, and estimated what would happen if you retrofitted those properties with a fortified roof. And what we found was that by retrofitting those properties, we could decrease the losses by 30 to 50%, which is pretty significant.
And Section 8 housing refers to affordable housing that is supported by vouchers that come from HUD. So it's an important source of affordable housing in our nation. And HUD, in the last few years, has had this program called the Green and Resilient Retrofit Program. funded with tremendous investment of over $800 million in grants, with an additional up to $4 billion, I think, in loan authority, which is designed to help these types of Section 8 housing units, whether they're multifamily or single family, to make necessary improvements to make them more energy efficient, the green part, and have better water systems and the like, but also to make them more resilient to severe weather, to climate change. And Fortified's actually called out in that Green and Resilient Retrofit program as one of the approved retrofits that will receive funding. So when we heard about that, we started thinking, okay, well, it's great that the Green and Resilient Retrofit program is going to cover fortified retrofits, but what would that actually mean if Section 8 housing en masse undertook these retrofits? And as Manuela said, the results are really, really powerful. Right? They can reduce damages by 30 to 50%, and that's just from having a fortified roof.
And of course, when we know this is, helping one of our most vulnerable populations remain housed, sometimes these folks don't even have the means to evacuate and need assistance evacuating. So it's really important, really, really neat idea to think of what a difference we could make if this were to come to fruition in real life. So definitely an interesting study there. And I want to talk more about meeting that need for investment. When we talk about Fortified so far, you gave me some numbers, Michael, and that's that $1 billion has been invested in Fortified so far. We need an additional $1.6 million to provide additional grants for Mobile County, and this is quite a striking number, $18.4 billion if we wanted to retrofit the state of Louisiana. So I think your point here is that we're not going to get $18 million in public investment. That's insufficient. So what do we do?
Yeah, we're really proud at IBHS that we've been able to drive over $1 billion toward fortified construction in a variety of states. And that includes the investments made in Louisiana in the multifamily space. The Louisiana Housing Corporation now requires fortified for all projects receiving low-income housing tax credits. They require fortified for all projects receiving these CDBG-DR grant dollars. We're talking about the retrofit programs that we discussed earlier. All of this money together, right, leads to more than $1 billion. And yet the need is so much greater. You mentioned Mobile County, that's $1.6 billion, billion with a B, to retrofit every single home in Mobile County with help from a $10,000 grant. Or to your point of $18.4 billion for the state of Louisiana, that would be giving every single homeowner in Louisiana a $10,000 grant to get a fortified roof. We can't do that. It's not reasonable at the local level. It's not reasonable at the state level. It's not reasonable at the federal level. So we need more. We need public investment as that catalyst we talked about earlier. But yes, we also need philanthropic support. We need private investment. We need investment at the big scale for multifamily projects. We need private investment at the small scale, like Manuela was talking about the loan program for NPHS out in California. We need to bring together as many strands of capital as we can around consistent ways to build with resilience. And so in that sense, IBHS science and IBHS programs, particularly Fortified and Wildfire Prepared, can be the link between these strands of capital, the thread that ties them together. So ultimately, we get to a point where we don't need to say resilient housing or survivable housing anymore. It just is that as the norm. That's just the way we build. It's what we expect. And it's the way housing is in our country. Going back to the marathon analogy from about an hour or so ago, we are maybe mile 2 of this marathon. We have a long way to go. We're very proud of our accomplishments, but we know how much work there is to do. I want to call out one organization in particular that's been a great partner over the last couple of years. We referenced it just a few minutes ago. It's the Federal Home Loan Bank of Dallas. For those who don't know, the Federal Home Loan Bank system is congressionally chartered. They are one of those organizations or one of those systems that helps provide the mortgage market in this country with liquidity. They loan money to banks, so the banks can loan money to you to buy things like houses and community development and the like. And the Federal Home Loan Bank of Dallas has a region that might be the riskiest in the nation. It extends from New Mexico to Texas, Louisiana, Arkansas, Mississippi. They get every flavor of severe weather there. And they, with their affordable housing program, you see federal home loan banks are required to put at least 10% of profits into affordable housing. They now all voluntarily do 15%. They said, we are going to try to use our affordable housing program to advance resilience of housing in our region. So they incentivize Fortified as a part of that funding for affordable housing development. They've also stood up a Fortified grant program called the Fortified Fund, where they've put over $4 million so far, with more to come hopefully over the next few years, into grants for new and existing single-family housing to get fortified roofs on top. They've been a great partner to us. We're hopeful we'll have opportunities to work with other federal home loan banks that will follow that model. And that's the type of thinking, the type of leadership, and the type of willingness to merge private and public capital together to advance resilience that we need to see all over the country.
Yeah, so making resilient housing the new normal.
That's
just
right.
Housing. We want it to be a part of everyday life. And of course, we know the goal is to keep, families and communities together and in place after these events. But it does have some monetary benefits. We know that resilient housing pays dividends, and some may be familiar with the accepted ratio of the return of investment on resilience based on NIBS research, that $1 invested in resilience and disaster preparedness reduces damage and cleanup costs by $6. There's actually a new report released fairly recently from Allstate and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation, and they found that every $1 spent in disaster resilience and preparedness actually saves $13 in economic impact, property damage, and cleanup costs. So we know this pays dividends, good return on investment when it comes to building resiliently. Talk about that.
Sure. Yeah. So there's compelling data on the economic case for resilience. The NID study is widely cited. Allstate in the chamber's report is also more recent, but equally compelling. What I really like about that report, the Allstate and Chamber report, is that they have specific scenarios about the savings for in particular areas based on different hazards. So, for example, they found that if you invested $83 million in resilience and climate resilience and preparedness ahead of a wildfire in Santa Fe, New Mexico, that could save over close to 400 jobs and keep more than $20 million in the area. They also highlighted another example of what $83 million in advancements and investments in resilience and preparedness ahead of a serious tornado in Nashville, Tennessee, could result in, and that's saving more than 5,300 jobs. And so it's pretty compelling.
Yeah, it's compelling, I think, in large part because it's looking holistically at the costs of severe weather. I think we have a tendency in this country sometimes to say, well, that's why I have insurance. The insurance industry is bunch of rich companies, and they're going to take care of this, and they should take care of this. And the fact is, severe weather has significant impacts, not just on individuals and on their insurance companies, but on the community, on the local tax base, on the disruption of business. There are so many layers to what happens. I referenced before the disaster after the disaster. Right? We have the natural disaster, and then we have the economic disaster that follows sometimes. And there's a study that we did just a couple years ago with CoreLogic that I think shows how this is more than just an insurance issue. we did this really fascinating study looking at mortgage delinquency rates following hurricanes. There's a pretty well understood issue that after there's a significant natural disaster, that there's a spike in the mortgage delinquency rates. And it makes sense. Right? People lose their homes, people lose their jobs, they're not able to pay their mortgage. Perhaps if they have a destroyed home, they don't want to pay their mortgage anymore. And so you have this spike. And that's imposes costs on everybody, on the whole system of how mortgages are originated and managed and sold and turned into mortgage-backed securities and the like. It's credit risk, essentially, when people no longer pay their mortgage. So we thought, well, what happens to that spike in mortgage delinquency rates? Is there some hidden information, if you dive into the data, on different types of housing, on more resilient or less resilient housing? And what we found is there is a statistically significant impact that building codes, modern building codes, have on that spike. Newer homes built to newer codes that are more resilient have a smaller incidence of mortgage delinquency than those that are older and were built with less resilience. And the people who live in those homes, even if they do become delinquent, are more likely to have a happy end to their story. And a mortgage delinquency ends one of three ways. Either the person gets current, the homeowner gets current, the homeowner is forced to sell their home and then pay off their loan, or the bank forecloses. And what we found is that for homes that are built to modern codes, you're more likely to have that happy outcome of coming current. So what we see is that the physical risk to the structure has a relationship to the credit risk of mortgage delinquencies. So this is not just an issue of insurance. This is an issue that has a lot more ramifications, and not to mention ramifications for the families. They don't want to become delinquent. They want to keep paying their mortgage. They want to keep living in their home. And having more resilient homes can help them to do that.
So resilience it's good for economies, good for families, local communities. It's also good for the environment. An estimated 50% of solid waste actually comes from construction and reconstruction debris from structures that are damaged by severe weather. That's really an incredible amount, and that's a big carbon footprint.
That's right. You can make a house as passive as you want to. You can make it as energy efficient as you want to. There is no better way to build a greenhouse than to build a house, or a green building, than to build a building that is going to withstand the severe weather, because it is not green when a structure ends up in a landfill.
Yeah, so just some added benefit there. So as we close out today, I want to pose a question, and that is, why should resilience be a priority for local governments? I know you guys work with local governments around the country, so how are you selling them on resilience?
Go ahead, Manuela.
Yeah, sure. So I grew up in South Florida, where hurricanes were a part of life. And so I understand how important this work is. The climate resilient homes, climate resilient businesses, climate resilient communities are essential. They're must-haves. And so my challenge would be for us all to find ways to prioritize resilience in our work.
Michael?
Well, I think that it's been referenced a couple times earlier in our conversation. If you lose your tax base, you can't provide services. And if you can't provide services, you lose more of a tax base. And so much of the foundation of a sense of community and a sense of a local economy really relies on having homes for people to live in and businesses for them to work in. That drives so much. It drives our social fabric, and it drives our economic fabric. And so if we can make those structures more resilient, more survivable, then we can keep that going. And a local economy has a blip when disaster strikes, but then can get back to its hopeful status quo of thriving. And it doesn't go into that cycle of loss that follows the economic disaster following the natural disaster.
You have a great story that you tell in a lot of your presentations about Port Aransas after Hurricane Harvey. Kind of tell us that story as we start to close things out today.
Yeah, so Hurricane Harvey hits the Texas coast, including Port Aransas, and destroys a whole lot of housing. And the mayor is interviewed, and he realizes, gosh, we are a tourist-based economy. We need to have workers for our economy to get back on track following this natural disaster, but we don't have any place to put them. We lost all of our housing from this hurricane. And that community at that point realized, gosh, resilient housing is really important for our workforce. It's really important, therefore, for our economy. And there is an awful lot more fortified housing in Port Aransas today than there was prior to Hurricane Harvey. To get back to this point of disaster recovery versus pre-disaster mitigation, I think the more we can make these changes on the front end on the sunny day, the less we're going to have that heartbreak on the day of the bad weather.
Final thoughts.
Manuela, you go first.
Thanks for having us on this to share about our work. We need more climate resilient communities. We have a path to get there, and we should all kind of come together and do our part in making sure that we reach that destination.
Yeah, and I'll say we are really proud of the work that's done by IBHS. Every single member of the IBHS team has a critical role in how we set up our experiments and build our specimens, our houses and commercial structures, how we plan that research, how we conduct that research, gather the data, analyze the data, turn that data into information for consumers, into podcasts like this, into our public policy, right? We're really proud of that work, and it is absolutely critical and necessary that IBHS plays the role of continuing to advance the scientific knowledge of the built environment and how severe weather impacts that built environment and how we can make our built environment more survivable. And yet, we also acknowledge that it's not sufficient to make societal change. IBHS cannot do it alone. We need that science and those solutions side by side with financial pathways to get people to a better place, to get communities to a better place when it comes to the safety, the security, the ability of their homes and their businesses to withstand severe weather. And so at the end of the day, it's about partnership, it's about collaboration, it's about bringing science together with the solutions, together with the financial pathways. It's about bringing different organizations, different stakeholders together. We really can do big things when we work together. And the need is great, and yet so is our ability to make change for our communities and for our country. And that's the great work that Manuela and I get to do every day with IBHS, and we really appreciate the time today with you, Rachel, to talk about it.
Yeah, thank you guys both so much for joining us today. Very insightful conversation here. You guys keep fighting the good fight as you hand off that awesome research done here at IBHS and helping to educate people around the country. So thank you for joining us today, and thank you for joining us on the Disaster Discussions podcast, and we'll be back next month with another brand new episode. We'll see you then. Thanks for listening to the Disaster Discussions podcast, an IBHS production. Subscribe to our podcast on your favorite podcast app or watch the podcast on our website at ibhs.org/disaster discussions podcast and on the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety's YouTube channel. Connect with us on our social media pages. And for more great content from IBHS, including ongoing research efforts happening at our facility and more, visit ibhs.org.